The morning air near Abilene, Texas, hung heavy and gray, just like the mood settled over Hank Doyle's farm. A thick blanket of clouds promised rain, but for Hank, the downpour had already begun inside him. He knelt beside Rusty, his old horse, whose once vibrant coat was now dull, his eyes clouded with pain. Hank's hand, calloused from years of working the land, gently stroked Rusty's bony neck. Each slow, rhythmic movement was a silent prayer, a desperate goodbye to a friend who had shared so many sunrises and sunsets. Rusty, frail and weak, barely moved. He'd been like this for days, his breath shallow, his strength fading. Hank felt a familiar ache in his chest, one that had grown steadily over the past few weeks as Rusty's condition worsened. He knew this day was coming, but knowing didn't make it any easier. He leaned closer, whispering soft words of comfort, remembering the young, spirited colt Rusty once was. Suddenly, Rusty stirred. With a surprising flicker of effort, he nudged Hank's hand, a soft, almost imperceptible pressure against his palm. Then, slowly, painfully, Rusty began to lower his head, his long neck arching, until he weakly wrapped it around Hank's shoulders. It wasn't a strong embrace, more like a fragile, final hug, a desperate cling to the man who had been his world. Hank felt the rough hair against his cheek, the slight warmth of Rusty's body, and a wave of grief washed over him, hot and stinging. He closed his eyes, holding the moment, wishing he could freeze time, wishing he could make everything better. Just then, Dr. Marlene Cutter stepped forward, her medical bag in hand. She was a no-nonsense woman, her face usually a mask of professional calm, especially during these difficult moments. She understood the pain, the necessity. She prepared the syringe, her movements precise and practiced. The community members who had gathered, their faces solemn, watched in hushed silence. They knew what was coming. It was the hard part of farm life, a kindness when no other kindness remained. Dr. Cutter's gaze, steady and focused, swept over Rusty one last time. It was a routine check, a final confirmation before she administered the sedative. Her eyes moved from his flank to his legs to his mane. Then they stopped. A tiny, almost invisible detail caught her attention, something subtle on Rusty's coat near his shoulder. Her professional solemnity cracked, replaced by a sharp, focused concern. Her brow furrowed slightly. She blinked, then looked again, leaning in closer. Her hand, which had been reaching for Rusty's neck, froze mid-air. The syringe remained poised, but she didn't move it. Her breath hitched. "Wait," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the heavy silence. "Hold on." Hank looked up, confused, his heart still aching from Rusty's embrace. The gathered neighbors exchanged puzzled glances. Dr. Cutter didn't elaborate immediately. She took a step back, her eyes still fixed on Rusty. Her expression was now a mix of disbelief and intense concentration. "Something isn't right here," she stated, her voice stronger this time, carrying a new urgency. "I can't proceed." A ripple of confusion spread through the small crowd. Whispers broke out, low and questioning. The unexpected halt hung in the air, a strange, sudden pause in what everyone had accepted as unavoidable. It was a quiet sense of, not yet, a breath of unexpected hope in the somber morning. Dr. Cutter turned to Hank, her gaze sharp and intense, cutting through his grief. "We need to investigate this further, Hank. This isn't what it seems." The fate of Rusty and the reason for the sudden stop remained a mystery, hanging in the balance. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any part of Rusty's story, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Hank Doyle had always been a man of the land, his roots running as deep into the Abilene soil as the ancient oaks that dotted his property. This wasn't just a farm, it was a legacy, passed down through generations. The sun-baked fields, the weathered barn, the familiar scent of hay and honest labor, these were the constants of his life. In Abilene, life moved at a different pace, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the community. Everyone knew everyone, and a helping hand was never far away, whether it was for harvest or for hardship. It was a place where traditions held strong, where a handshake still meant something, and where the bond between a farmer and his animals was understood without a single word needing to be spoken. Hank himself was a quiet man, his thoughts often clearer in the vast expanse of his fields than in the company of others. His hands, calloused and strong, told the story of a life spent working the earth, coaxing sustenance from it. He wasn't one for grand pronouncements or flashy gestures. His dreams were humble but profound: to keep the farm thriving, to honor the sacrifices of those who came before him, and to leave something meaningful for whatever future generations might follow. He understood the challenges of modern farming, the rising costs, the unpredictable weather, the constant pressure to keep up. It was a struggle, sometimes a lonely one, but it was his struggle, and he faced it with a quiet, unyielding determination that was characteristic of the Doyle men. Rusty had arrived on the farm nearly 15 years ago, a gangly, bright-eyed colt with a spirit as untamed as the West Texas wind. Hank remembered the day clearly. He had bought Rusty at a small auction, a last-minute decision driven by a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The farm needed a new workhorse, yes, but there was something about Rusty's intelligent eyes, even then, that spoke to Hank. He was an investment, a tool for the farm, but from the very beginning, he was more. Hank had spent countless hours with the young horse, patiently training him, teaching him the ropes of farm life. He taught Rusty to pull the plow, to navigate the rocky terrain, to respond to his voice with just a subtle shift of the reins. In return, Rusty offered unwavering loyalty and a companionship that filled a quiet corner of Hank's life. He saw in Rusty a reflection of his own resilience, a creature that faced each day's labor with a steadfast heart. Rusty wasn't just an animal. He was a partner, a confidant in the silent language of the fields. He embodied Hank's hopes, his unspoken prayers for good harvests, his quiet pride in the land. Over the years, Rusty had grown into a magnificent animal, his coat a rich, burnished chestnut, his mane a flowing testament to his strength. He was a familiar sight to anyone traveling the dusty roads near Hank's farm, a symbol of enduring rural life. He had pulled more plows, hauled more hay, and carried Hank on more solitary rides than Hank could count. Through lean years and prosperous ones, Rusty had been there, a constant presence, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm against the backdrop of Hank's often turbulent thoughts. The bond between them had deepened with every sunrise they shared, every task they completed together. Rusty had witnessed Hank's silent struggles, his small victories, and his fleeting moments of doubt. He had become an extension of Hank's own will, a living, breathing testament to the years of hard work and dedication that defined the Doyle farm. This deep emotional history was why the scene earlier, the decision to put Rusty down, had been so profoundly heartbreaking for Hank. It wasn't just losing a horse, it was losing a part of himself, a piece of his history, and a silent witness to his life's journey. The thought of letting him go had been agonizing, a choice born of perceived necessity, a desperate measure to end what Hank believed was inevitable suffering. But even the strongest bonds, the deepest connections, can start to fray, sometimes so slowly you don't even notice until it's too late. Looking back, Hank could see the tiny cracks that had formed, first in his relationship with Rusty, and then, almost without him realizing it, in his own connection to the farm life he loved so much. It wasn't one big thing. It was 1,000 small things, like pebbles dropped into a well, slowly filling it up until there was no room left. The financial strain had been a constant, low hum in the background for years. Crop prices were always too low, feed costs always too high. There were times Hank had to choose between repairing a fence or buying new parts for the tractor. He'd always chosen the farm, always put its needs first, even if it meant tightening his own belt until it hurt. This pressure, this never-ending worry about money, had started to chip away at his spirit. He spent more time alone, hunched over ledgers, trying to make numbers add up that simply wouldn't. His conversations grew shorter, his laughter less frequent. He was becoming isolated, even in the heart of his own community, trapped by the weight of his responsibilities. Then there were the unfulfilled expectations, not from others, not directly, but from the demanding rural life itself. Hank had always believed that hard work paid off, that dedication would bring prosperity. But the reality was often harsher. A late frost, an early drought, a sudden market crash. Any one of these could wipe out a season's worth of sweat and toil. He'd seen his neighbors give up, sell their land, move to the city, chasing an easier life. Hank had always resisted, always held on, but the constant fight took its toll. He started to question if his stubbornness was a virtue or just plain foolishness. Rusty, in his own quiet way, had also started to show the signs of this slow decline. It wasn't sudden. It began with a slight stiffness in his gait after a long day, then a reluctance to start working in the mornings. Hank, always busy, always focused on the next task, had brushed it off at first. Just old age, he'd told himself, happens to all of us. He'd given Rusty a little extra feed, a bit more rest, but he hadn't truly stopped to look, to listen to what the horse was trying to tell him. He'd overlooked the subtle signs, the way Rusty's eyes sometimes seemed a little duller, the way he hesitated before stepping over a small ditch. These weren't malicious oversights, but rather the cumulative effect of a man stretched thin, burdened by worries, and slowly losing his grip on the details that once defined his world. He'd started to rely more on the vet's quick assessment, less on his own intuition, his own deep understanding of his animals. When Dr. Cutter had suggested Rusty's condition was irreversible, Hank had accepted it, not because he wanted to, but because it felt like the final, inevitable outcome of years of struggle and neglect, both his own and the farm's. The decision to put Rusty down, then, wasn't a sudden, cruel act. It was the painful culmination of years of mounting pressures, of overlooked warnings, and of a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling of the threads that held Hank's life together. Rusty's declining health had become a mirror reflecting Hank's own exhaustion, his own quiet despair. It felt like the last straw, the final surrender to a life that had become too heavy to carry. He believed he was doing the right thing, ending suffering, but deep down, it was also an admission of his own defeat, a giving up on a part of himself he couldn't save. The air around the Doyle farm became thick, not just with the scent of hay and damp earth, but with a growing tension that everyone could feel. Dr. Cutter's abrupt stop, her firm declaration that something wasn't right, had ripped a hole in the quiet solemnity, and now the community was filling that hole with whispers. What had seemed like a sad but necessary end to Rusty's life had suddenly become a public spectacle, and Hank found himself at the center of it, exposed and vulnerable. The initial shock gave way to a creeping unease. People started talking, first in hushed tones, then more openly, especially at the general store and after Sunday service. Old rivalries, long buried under the surface of community politeness, started to peek out. There were folks who remembered Hank's father, a man known for his meticulous farming, and they wondered aloud if Hank was really living up to that legacy. They questioned his methods, his choices, and especially his perceived attachment to an old, ailing horse. Some implied he was being sentimental, holding on to something that should have been let go ages ago, wasting resources better spent elsewhere. Others, the ones who had always been a little jealous of the Doyle land or Hank's quiet success. Choyala Doyak saw an opportunity. They murmured about how a good farmer wouldn't let a horse get to that state, or why Hank hadn't called a different vet sooner. Dr. Cutter's professional integrity also started to face subtle questioning. She was new to the area, having only taken over the practice a couple of years back. Some of the older farmers, set in their ways, preferred the grizzled, familiar vet who had retired. They wondered if she was being overly cautious, or worse, trying to make a name for herself by creating drama where there wasn't any. "Just put the poor animal out of its misery," one old-timer grumbled, loud enough for others to hear. The pressure on Dr. Cutter to explain her actions mounted daily. Phone calls from concerned neighbors, veiled questions from colleagues, even a polite but pointed inquiry from the local agricultural board. Each interaction made her more guarded, more determined. She knew she had seen something, a flicker, a subtle physical detail that just didn't fit with the diagnosis everyone, including herself, had initially accepted. This wasn't about her reputation anymore. It was about getting it right, even if it meant standing alone. She spent her evenings poring over veterinary texts, making calls to specialists in other states, trying to piece together the puzzle. She felt like she was swimming against a strong current, but the conviction that something was deeply wrong kept her pushing forward. Hank felt the weight of public scrutiny like a physical burden. Every sideways glance, every hushed conversation he overheard, chipped away at his already fragile composure. He'd always been a private man, preferring the company of his fields and his animals to idle gossip. Now his deepest sorrow was laid bare for everyone to dissect. His internal struggle intensified. A part of him wanted to just let Dr. Cutter do whatever she needed to do to prove her point, to clear the air, to just get it over with. But another part, the part that had embraced Rusty that morning, felt a flicker of hope, a desperate need for her to be right. He was caught between wanting the truth and wanting to disappear, to escape the relentless eyes of his community. The farm, once his sanctuary, now felt like a stage where his personal tragedy was playing out for all to see. The turning point arrived 3 days later, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, almost academic certainty. Dr. Cutter had spent sleepless nights, cross-referencing symptoms, consulting with a veterinary neurologist she knew from her university days, and running a battery of specialized tests that had to be sent out to a lab in Austin. The results finally came back on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat in her office, the fluorescent lights humming, and stared at the printouts. It wasn't a misdiagnosis in the conventional sense, not outright negligence, but a rare, tricky condition that mimicked the symptoms of something far more common and untreatable. Rusty wasn't suffering from advanced degenerative joint disease as initially thought. Instead, the tests pointed to a very specific, unusual neurological disorder, a type of demyelinating polyneuropathy. It was uncommon in horses, often mistaken for other ailments, especially in its early stages. The subtle details Dr. Cutter had noticed, the uneven muscle atrophy, a specific tremor pattern she'd picked up on, the way Rusty had leaned into Hank's embrace with an almost exaggerated pressure, all suddenly made perfect sense. This condition, while serious, was treatable, or at least manageable, with a very specific, intensive course of medication and physical therapy. It wasn't a death sentence. This revelation was devastating in a way that went beyond Rusty. It implicated a broader issue, not necessarily within local veterinary practices directly, but certainly highlighted a gap in knowledge. If she, a relatively new vet, had almost missed it, how many others had? It also raised questions about the standard diagnostic protocols, and perhaps even the availability of advanced testing in rural areas. It wasn't just about Rusty, it revealed a systemic problem, a potential silent epidemic of misdiagnosed cases that could be affecting other animals in the region. The thought made her stomach churn. Dr. Cutter drove straight to Hank's farm, the printed reports clutched in her hand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She found Hank in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, just watching Rusty. The horse looked weaker, but there was still a spark in his eyes, a flicker of life that had always drawn Hank to him. "Hank," she started, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I have the results. It's not what we thought." Hank slowly turned, his face a mask of weary resignation. "What is it, Doc?" She laid out the reports, explaining the complex medical terms in simple language. She talked about the polyneuropathy, the possibility of recovery, the treatment plan. Hank listened, his eyes wide, a slow dawning of hope mixed with disbelief spreading across his features. He looked at Rusty, then back at Dr. Cutter. "You mean, he might not have to go?" Hank's voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion. Dr. Cutter nodded. "He has a fighting chance, Hank. A good one, if we start treatment right away. It'll be a long road and expensive, but it's not hopeless. Not anymore." Hank was faced with a choice. Accept this new diagnosis, fight for Rusty's recovery, and potentially face the judgment of those who thought he was just prolonging the inevitable. Or succumb to the pressure, stick to the original, easier plan, and let Rusty go. The community's whispers, the financial strain, the exhaustion of the last few days, all weighed heavily on him. But then he looked at Rusty, who nudged his hand gently, a soft wicker escaping his lips. Dr. Cutter, now fully committed, knew this wasn't just about Rusty's life. It was about professional integrity, about exposing a truth that might make some people uncomfortable. She was prepared to expose the findings, to push for wider awareness, despite the potential professional backlash she might face. This moment shattered the previous narrative of a sad, inevitable end. It opened a new path, one filled with uncertainty, but also with a fierce, unexpected hope. Hank grappled with a whirlwind of emotions. Relief washed over him, a powerful wave that threatened to buckle his knees. Rusty might be saved. The thought, so foreign just hours ago, now filled his chest with a light he hadn't felt in years. But then came the anger, a hot, bitter surge. Anger at himself for not questioning the first diagnosis more, for letting despair cloud his judgment. Anger at the system, at the vets who had missed this. And profound guilt, a heavy stone in his gut for having been so ready to give up, to let his old friend go. He looked at Rusty, who seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. His ears perked slightly. Hank reached out, his fingers tracing the horse's soft muzzle. The news spread through Abilene like wildfire. Dr. Cutter's revelation was the kind of story that got people talking, especially in a community where everyone knew everyone and everyone had an opinion. The immediate consequences were clear. The town divided. Some neighbors, mostly those who had always held a soft spot for Hank and Rusty, rallied around him. They offered help, support, and even shared their own stories of misdiagnosed animals or questionable veterinary advice. Old man Peterson, who ran the hardware store and had seen generations of Doyles come and go, stopped by with a sack of feed supplements he swore by. "Never trust a doctor who doesn't listen to the animal, Hank," he grumbled, giving Hank a firm pat on the shoulder. Maria Rodriguez, whose family had run the local diner for decades, brought over a hot meal, a silent gesture of solidarity. They saw Hank's fight for Rusty as a fight for something bigger, for the integrity of their community, for the belief that even the smallest life had value. They were tired of slick city vets coming in and telling them what was what without truly understanding their way of life. But others, particularly those who were more entrenched in the existing social structures or had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, became openly hostile. They whispered about Hank being sentimental or stubborn, accusing him of prolonging an animal's suffering for his own emotional needs. Some even suggested Dr. Cutter was just trying to make a name for herself, stirring up trouble where there was none. Mrs. Henderson, whose prize-winning show pony had been treated by the same vets Hank initially consulted, was particularly vocal. She felt personally insulted, as if Dr. Cutter's findings somehow invalidated her own choices. These people, wary of disrupting the established order or having their own past decisions questioned, saw Hank's new path as a challenge to their own judgment. They didn't want to think that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong too, or that a system they trusted had failed. The deeply ingrained rural distrust of external interference now played out in full force. Dr. Cutter, an outsider in many ways, was both a hero and a pariah. Her scientific approach, while groundbreaking, clashed with the traditional, often unexamined practices that had been in place for years. The strong community ties of Abilene, usually a source of comfort, now became a suffocating net, pulling Hank in different directions. Every glance, every whispered conversation felt like a judgment. The psychological toll on Hank was immense. He'd lived his life by a code of quiet resilience, of making tough decisions for the good of the farm and the animals. Now, he was confronting his own judgment, the potential ramifications of this revelation, and the stark division it created among his neighbors. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet, paradoxically, stronger than he had been in a long time. The thought of Rusty, alive and potentially recovering, was a powerful antidote to the weight of public scrutiny. He knew this road wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of genuine hope. Hank, with Dr. Cutter's unwavering support, embarked on the difficult journey to nurse Rusty back to health. It was a slow process, filled with small victories and frustrating setbacks, but each day brought a little more hope. Dr. Cutter spent countless hours at the farm, meticulously adjusting Rusty's diet, administering new medications, and monitoring his progress. She taught Hank how to manage the complex regimen, how to spot subtle changes in Rusty's demeanor, and how to perform certain therapeutic exercises. Hank, in turn, dedicated himself entirely to Rusty's recovery, his guilt slowly transforming into a fierce determination. He cleaned the stalls with renewed vigor, spent hours grooming Rusty, talking to him in soft, comforting tones. The bond between them, once strained by Hank's despair, was now forged anew, stronger than ever. The discovery of the rare neurological condition didn't just save Rusty. It triggered a much wider investigation into the local veterinary practices. Dr. Cutter, armed with irrefutable evidence and the courage of her convictions, presented her findings to the state veterinary board. The board, initially hesitant to challenge established professionals, couldn't ignore the clear scientific data she provided. They launched a full-scale inquiry, reviewing patient records, feed suppliers, and diagnostic procedures across multiple clinics in the region. What they uncovered was a pattern of inadequate diagnostics, reliance on outdated methods, and in some cases a deliberate disregard for complex symptoms that didn't fit simple explanations. The feed supplier, it turned out, had been cutting corners, leading to nutritional deficiencies that exacerbated underlying conditions in several animals, including Rusty. The individuals and entities responsible for the systemic failures faced significant professional repercussions. Several veterinarians had their licenses suspended or revoked, and clinics were fined heavily for negligence. The feed supplier was forced to recall thousands of pounds of product and faced a class action lawsuit from affected farmers. The pride of the local veterinary establishment crumbled under the weight of the truth. It was a difficult, messy process, but it brought a profound sense of justice, not just for Rusty and Hank, but for countless other animals and their owners who had suffered in silence. The community, once divided, slowly began to heal, realizing that challenging the status quo, even when uncomfortable, was sometimes necessary for progress. Rusty's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Slowly the tremors subsided, his gait became steadier, and the light returned to his eyes. He started to graze in the pasture again, a familiar sight that brought tears to Hank's eyes. He wasn't the same spirited horse he once was, but he was alive, comfortable, and clearly happy. His recovery symbolized Hank's own personal transformation. Hank had learned to trust his instincts again, to fight for what he believed in, and to accept help when it was offered. He was no longer the isolated, burdened farmer, but a man renewed by resilience and an unexpected battle. The story concluded with a quiet, peaceful scene. Hank stood in the pasture, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fields. Rusty, his coat gleaming, nudged Hank's hand gently, asking for an ear scratch. Dr. Cutter joined them, a soft smile on her face. She had become a regular visitor, not just as Rusty's vet, but as a trusted friend. They talked about the farm, about new planting seasons, about the future. The bond between them, forged in crisis, was now an unbreakable thread in the fabric of their lives. Hank knew life could throw unexpected turns, but he also knew the importance of unwavering belief, of standing up for what was right, and of the quiet strength